The Aryan Brotherhood stormed a funeral. They never imagined who was inside the coffin. The rain hammered down on the streets of Bakersfield, California, turning the asphalt into rivers of black glass. Inside St. Mary's Chapel, the air was thick with grief and the scent of funeral flowers. Marcus Webb's body lay in an open casket at the front of the small church, surrounded by white lilies and carnations. His mother sat in the front pew, her face buried in her hands, shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Behind her, rows of mourners dressed in black filled the wooden benches, their heads bowed in respect for the 28-year-old man whose life had been cut short in a drive-by shooting 3 nights ago. Outside, 4 black SUVs rolled slowly down the street, their windows tinted so dark they seemed to swallow the grey daylight. Inside the lead vehicle, Travis Reaper McGill sat with his arms crossed over his chest, his neck covered in tattoos that crawled up to his jawline. The lightning bolts and swastikas inked into his skin told a story of violence and allegiance to the Aryan Brotherhood, one of the most feared white supremacist prison gangs in America. His pale blue eyes were cold as he stared at the chapel ahead. If you're watching this, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment telling us where you're from. Now back to what happened next. Marcus Webb was no saint, Reaper said, his voice low and gravelly. He ran with the East Side Kings, moved weight for them, and he knew too much about our operation. Someone put him down before he could talk. But that's not why we're here. In the passenger seat, Danny Kraus turned to look at his superior. Danny was younger, maybe 25, with a shaved head and nervous energy that made his leg bounce constantly. Then why are we here, boss? The man's dead. Let his people bury him. Reaper's jaw tightened. Because Marcus didn't die in that drive-by, the coroner who signed off on his death certificate, one of ours. Marcus Webb is alive, and he's hiding in that coffin waiting for this funeral to end so he can disappear into witness protection. The feds think they're clever. They think we don't have eyes everywhere. Danny's eyes widened. You're serious? He's in there right now. Breathing through a tube they installed in the coffin. Once this service ends, they'll load him into a hearse, drive him to a secure location, and he'll testify against us in 3 weeks. Every deal we've made, every connection we have on the outside, he knows it all. We're not letting that happen. The SUVs parked across the street from the chapel. 12 men emerged, all wearing long black coats that concealed the weapons strapped to their bodies. They moved with the confidence of men who had done terrible things and expected to do more. Reaper led the way, his boots splashing through puddles as he crossed the street. The rain was a gift, he thought. It would wash away evidence, muffle screams, and keep witnesses indoors. Inside the chapel, Marcus's mother had just stood to speak. Her voice trembled as she began to share memories of her son, how he had loved basketball as a child, how he had promised to turn his life around. The mourners listened with the weight of shared grief, unaware of the storm about to break through their doors. Reaper pushed through the chapel entrance first. The heavy wooden doors slammed open with a crash that echoed through the sacred space. Heads turned, gasps rippled through the crowd. Marcus's mother froze mid-sentence, her face draining of color as she recognized the symbols on the men's necks and hands. Nobody moves, Reaper announced, pulling a Glock from inside his coat. His men spread out along the sides of the chapel, weapons drawn, covering every exit. We're not here for you. We're here for Marcus. A woman in the back screamed. Several mourners reached for their phones, but Danny fired a warning shot into the ceiling. Plaster and dust rained down, and the message was clear. No one was calling the police. Father O'Brien, the elderly priest who had been conducting the service, stepped forward with his hands raised. Please, this is a house of God. Whatever grievance you have, this is not the place. Shut up, old man, Reaper interrupted, walking down the center aisle toward the coffin. His boots clicked against the floor with each step, the sound unnaturally loud in the terrified silence. Marcus Webb is a rat. He made a deal with the feds to testify against the Brotherhood. That makes this place exactly where we need to be. Marcus's mother let out a wail of despair. My son is dead. Can't you see? He's dead. Leave us alone. Reaper reached the coffin and looked down at the body inside. Marcus was dressed in a black suit, his hands folded across his chest, his face peaceful in artificial repose. The makeup artists had done excellent work. To anyone who didn't know the truth, he looked genuinely deceased. But Reaper knew. He had paid good money for the information that had brought him here. "Everyone out," Reaper commanded, gesturing with his gun toward the exits. "Now. You've got 30 seconds before we start shooting people." The mourners scrambled for the doors in a panicked rush. Marcus's mother had to be physically dragged away by her sister, screaming and reaching back toward her son's coffin. Within moments, the chapel was empty except for Reaper's crew and the man in the casket. Reaper leaned over the coffin, studying Marcus's face carefully. He reached out and pressed 2 fingers against Marcus's neck, feeling for a pulse. Nothing. He pressed harder, moving his fingers to a different position. Still nothing. Doubt flickered across his features. He looked up at Danny, who had joined him at the front of the chapel. "You sure about this?" Danny asked nervously. "Maybe your source was wrong. Maybe he really is dead." "He's not dead," Reaper insisted, but his voice carried less certainty now. He grabbed Marcus's wrist and felt for a pulse there. Nothing. He lifted one of Marcus's eyelids. The eye beneath was glassy and unfocused. The information was solid. "The coroner is one of ours. This is a setup." "Then where's the breathing tube?" another member of the crew asked, a heavy-set man named Cole, who was checking the sides and bottom of the coffin. "There's nothing here, Reaper. No tube, no holes, no way for air to get in." Reaper's mind raced. This wasn't making sense. The coroner had been explicit. Marcus was alive, hiding in plain sight at his own funeral, waiting to be transported to safety. But everything he was seeing contradicted that information. He pulled out his phone and dialed the coroner's number. It rang once, then went to voicemail. He tried again, same result. "Something's wrong," Reaper muttered. "Check the back of the chapel. See if there's another exit they might have used." While his men searched, Reaper stared down at Marcus's body, his frustration mounting. If Marcus wasn't in the coffin, then where was he? Had the feds moved him already? Had they anticipated the Brotherhood's move and changed their plans? Or worse, had Reaper been fed false information to make him expose his hand? The sound of sirens in the distance answered his question. Multiple sirens growing louder by the second. Reaper's blood ran cold. They had been set up. The whole thing was a trap. "We need to go," Danny urged, his voice rising in panic. "Now, Reaper." "The cops are coming." But Reaper couldn't move. He stood frozen at the coffin, staring at Marcus's peaceful face, understanding flooding through him like ice water. The coroner hadn't been one of theirs. The Brotherhood had been infiltrated. Someone had fed them false information, knowing they would storm the funeral, knowing they would be caught in the act. And now, with a chapel full of witnesses who had seen their faces, with security cameras that had recorded everything, they were finished. "Boss!" Cole shouted from the entrance. "Police are 2 blocks away. We have to move." Reaper finally tore his gaze from the coffin and ran. His crew followed him out the front doors and into the rain. The SUVs roared to life, but before they could pull away from the curb, police cars screeched around the corner, blocking their path. Officers poured out with weapons drawn, shouting commands. "Get on the ground, hands where we can see them!" For a moment, Reaper considered fighting. His hand moved toward his gun, but he saw the tactical team taking positions, saw the rifles trained on his chest and knew they wouldn't make it 5 feet. Slowly he raised his hands above his head. His crew did the same. As Reaper was forced to his knees on the wet pavement, hands cuffed behind his back, he looked back at the chapel. Through the open doors he could see the coffin still sitting at the front. And then he saw movement. The coffin lid shifted slightly. Marcus Webb's hand emerged, pushing the lid fully open. He sat up, very much alive, and climbed out of the coffin. He was wearing a wire. The entire confrontation had been recorded. Marcus walked to the chapel entrance and stood there, looking down at Reaper with an expression that mixed triumph and sadness. A federal agent appeared beside him, placing a protective hand on his shoulder. Reaper's laugh was bitter and cold. "You played us." "You played yourselves," Marcus replied quietly. "I never agreed to testify. That was a lie we planted through your compromised coroner. We knew you'd come for me if you thought I was turning. Now we have you on video storming a funeral, terrorizing civilians, making threats. Your Brotherhood just gave us everything we needed without me saying a word." As Reaper was hauled to his feet and pushed toward a waiting police car, the reality of his situation settled over him like a shroud. They had been so certain of their intelligence, so confident in their network of informants and corrupt officials, but the feds had been 2 steps ahead the entire time. The Aryan Brotherhood had stormed a funeral expecting to find a rat hiding in a coffin. Instead, they had found their own destruction waiting for them, wrapped in flowers and dressed for burial. Marcus watched from the chapel steps as the SUVs were impounded and the crew members were loaded into separate vehicles. The rain continued to fall, washing the blood from a scraped knee where one officer had tackled a fleeing gang member. In 3 hours, this street would be clean again, the evidence processed, the witnesses interviewed. But the damage to the Aryan Brotherhood would last for years. Father O'Brien appeared beside Marcus, his face pale but composed. "You used a house of God for this deception. I used it to stop men who would have killed me and anyone else who got in their way," Marcus responded. "Sometimes you have to lie in a coffin to expose the truth." The priest had no response to that. He simply made the sign of the cross and retreated back into his chapel to assess the damage. Marcus turned to the federal agent beside him, a woman named Sarah Chen who had orchestrated the entire operation. "What happens now?" Marcus asked. "Now we process them, build our case, and you get to actually disappear into witness protection," Chen replied. "But this time it's real. New name, new city, new life. You're done with all of this." Marcus nodded slowly, watching as Reaper's face appeared in the window of a police car, staring back at him with pure hatred. In that moment, Marcus understood that even from prison, the Brotherhood would want revenge. There would be a price on his head for the rest of his life. But he had made his choice. He had climbed into that coffin, knowing he might never climb out, with his old identity intact. The police cars pulled away one by one, their sirens echoing through the Bakersfield streets. The crowd of mourners had gathered across the street, held back by police tape, watching with expressions of shock and confusion. Marcus's mother broke free from her sister's grasp and ran toward him, tears streaming down her face. She wrapped her arms around him, sobbing into his shoulder. "I thought I'd lost you," she cried. "When they told me about the plan, I thought I'd lost you forever." "I'm sorry, Mom," Marcus whispered, holding her tight. "I'm so sorry for everything. For the life I lived, for the choices I made, for putting you through this. But it's over now, I'm getting out." She pulled back to look at his face, her hands cupping his cheeks. "Promise me. Promise me you'll stay away from all of this. Build something good with the second chance they're giving you." "I promise," Marcus said, and he meant it. He had spent 28 years running with gangs, selling drugs, living by a code that valued violence and loyalty above all else. He had seen friends die, had attended real funerals for people who deserved better, and now, standing in front of a chapel where he had faked his own death, he understood the weight of that waste. Agent Chen approached gently. "Mrs. Webb, I'm sorry, but we need to move Marcus now. The longer he stays visible, the more risk we take." Marcus's mother nodded through her tears, kissing her son's forehead one last time. "Be safe, and call me when you can, whatever name they give you." "I will," Marcus promised. He let Chen guide him toward an unmarked sedan, taking one last look at the chapel, at the street where he'd grown up, at the life he was leaving behind. Then he climbed into the car, and it pulled away into the rain. Inside the police station, Reaper sat in an interrogation room with his public defender, a tired-looking woman in her 40s who had already explained his situation in painful detail. The charges were extensive: assault, terroristic threats, illegal weapons possession, conspiracy. With his record and the video evidence, he was looking at decades in prison. The Brotherhood would continue without him, but his role as a leader was finished. Detective James Rodriguez entered the room, carrying a folder thick with documents. He was a veteran investigator, Latino, in his mid-50s, with the weary look of someone who had seen the worst humanity had to offer. He sat down across from Reaper and opened the folder. "Travis McGill, also known as Reaper," Rodriguez began, reading from the file. "3 prior convictions for assault, 1 for attempted murder, multiple disciplinary actions while incarcerated. You've been a ranking member of the Aryan Brotherhood for 8 years. And now you've added storming a funeral service and threatening civilians to your resume. Tell me, was it worth it? Reaper said nothing. He stared at the wall behind Rodriguez, his face expressionless. Marcus Webb was never going to testify, Rodriguez continued. We fed that information through your corrupted coroner specifically to draw you out. Every piece of intelligence you thought you had was designed to bring you to that chapel today. And you fell for it completely. Still, Reaper remained silent. He had been through interrogations before. He knew the game. Say nothing, admit nothing, let the lawyers handle it. Rodriguez leaned forward, his voice dropping lower. Here's what you don't know. Your coroner. He's been working with us for 6 months. Every piece of information he gave you during that time was vetted by federal agents. We've mapped your entire distribution network, identified your suppliers, located your safe houses. This operation wasn't just about catching you at a funeral. It was about dismantling your entire organization from the inside out. For the first time, Reaper's expression flickered. A muscle in his jaw tightened. He turned his pale eyes toward Rodriguez, searching for the lie in the detective's words. Tomorrow morning, federal agents will execute simultaneous raids on 16 locations across California, Rodriguez said. By this time next week, the Aryan Brotherhood's outside operations will be crippled. All because you thought you were smarter than us. All because you believed your intelligence was good. Reaper's hands clenched into fists on the table. We have people everywhere, lawyers, guards, officials. You think this stops anything? Someone will take my place. Someone always does. Maybe, Rodriguez acknowledged, but it won't be you. And every time one of you falls, it gets harder to rebuild. Eventually, you run out of people willing to die for a cause built on hate. The public defender touched Reaper's arm, warning him to stop talking. But the damage was already done. The Brotherhood's infrastructure was about to collapse, and Reaper would spend the best years of his life watching it happen from a prison cell. Back at a safe house 3 hours outside Bakersfield, Marcus sat at a kitchen table with Agent Chen and 2 U.S. Marshals who would be handling his relocation. They had given him a folder containing his new identity, Michael Ortiz, originally from Texas, with a complete background story and documentation. He would be moving to Portland, Oregon, where the Brotherhood's presence was minimal. You'll have support for the first 6 months, one of the marshals explained. Help finding a job, getting an apartment, integrating into the community. After that, you're on your own. The key to staying safe is becoming boring. No drama, no attention, no connections to your old life. Marcus stared at the driver's license with his new name and photo. Michael Ortiz looked back at him, same face but different person. It felt surreal, like he was attending his own funeral for real this time. What about my mom? Marcus asked. When can I see her again? Agent Chen's expression softened with sympathy. The first year, no contact at all. After that, if the threat level has decreased, we might arrange supervised visits in neutral locations. But Marcus, you need to understand that the people who want you dead don't forget. Your mother will be under surveillance by the Brotherhood to see if you reach out. Any contact puts her in danger. Marcus closed his eyes, the weight of that reality crushing. He had saved himself by faking his death, but in doing so, he had lost everyone he cared about. His mother, his siblings, the few real friends he'd had before gangs consumed his life. They would all have to grieve him as if he were truly dead. And in a way, he was. Marcus Webb had died in that coffin. Only Michael Ortiz had climbed out. Can I write her a letter? Marcus asked quietly. Something she can read later so she knows I'm thinking about her. Chen considered this, then nodded. One letter. We'll hold it and deliver it after you're settled, and we're certain there's no surveillance risk. But Marcus, it can't contain any identifying information about your new location or identity, just your feelings. Marcus accepted a pen and paper, and for the next hour, he wrote to his mother. He told her about his regrets, about the guilt he carried for the pain he'd caused her, about his hope for a better future. He told her he loved her and would think of her every day. When he finished, he folded the letter carefully and handed it to Chen, feeling like he was sealing away the last piece of his old life. That night, Marcus lay in an unfamiliar bed in the safe house, listening to rain continue its assault on the windows. Sleep wouldn't come. His mind replayed the moment when Reaper had leaned over the coffin, searching for a pulse, the doubt and then fury in the man's eyes when he realized he'd been deceived. Marcus had felt Reaper's fingers pressing against his neck, had fought every instinct to remain perfectly still, controlling his breathing, trusting the beta blockers the doctors had given him to slow his heart rate to nearly undetectable levels. It had been the most terrifying experience of his life, lying there helpless while armed men decided his fate. If anything had gone wrong, if Reaper had decided to shoot first and investigate later, the plan would have ended with Marcus actually dead in that coffin. But the feds had gambled that Reaper's caution and paranoia would make him hesitate, would make him search for certainty before acting. They had been right. Morning came slowly, grey light filtering through cheap curtains. Marcus showered, dressed in the new clothes they'd provided, and ate a breakfast he barely tasted. By noon he was in a car heading north toward Oregon, watching California disappear in the rearview mirror. The marshals drove in silence, their eyes constantly checking the mirrors, taking random exits and side roads to ensure they weren't followed. Portland greeted him with overcast skies and the smell of coffee from a nearby roaster. The apartment they'd secured for him was small but clean, in a quiet neighborhood where people minded their own business. The marshals helped him move in a few basic furnishings, then went over his cover story one final time. "You're Michael Ortiz. You moved here for a fresh start after getting sober. You worked construction in Texas and are looking for similar work here. Keep it simple, keep it consistent, and don't elaborate unless necessary. The best lies are the ones closest to the truth." After they left, Marcus stood alone in his new apartment, surrounded by boxes that contained a stranger's life. He walked to the window and looked out at a street where no one knew his name, where no one wanted him dead, where he could theoretically start over, but the freedom felt hollow. He had escaped the Brotherhood, escaped certain death, and in doing so had imprisoned himself in a different kind of cage. His phone rang. It was a prepaid number he didn't recognize. He answered cautiously. "Marcus Webb is dead," Agent Chen's voice came through. "From this moment on, you're Michael Ortiz. The raids went down this morning. 16 locations, 43 arrests. The Brotherhood's distribution network is in chaos. You did that. Your courage made it possible." "Doesn't feel like courage," Marcus replied quietly. "Feels like I'm the only one who survived when everyone around me is either dead or in prison." "That's because you're the only one who chose differently," Chen said. "You can honor that choice by building something worth living for, or you can waste it by looking back. Your call, Michael." She hung up before he could respond. Marcus set the phone down and returned to the window. The street below was busy with afternoon traffic, people heading home from work, living their normal lives without looking over their shoulders. He wanted that normalcy more than anything. He wanted to be boring, anonymous, free. Over the next 6 months, Michael Ortiz became real. Marcus found work with a construction company, showed up on time every day, kept his head down and his mouth shut. He rented movies from a local shop, bought groceries at the same store every week, established routines that anchored him in his new identity. Slowly, the paranoia began to fade. The constant checking over his shoulder, the startled reactions to loud noises, the nightmares of waking up in the coffin unable to move, they all gradually lessened. He made a friend at work, a guy named Tom who had also come to Portland for a fresh start after a divorce. They'd grab beers after shift sometimes, talk about sports and weather, and nothing of consequence. It was the most normal friendship Marcus had ever had, built on nothing more than proximity and shared experience. There were no blood oaths, no criminal conspiracies, no violence lurking beneath the surface. Just two guys who worked together and occasionally hung out. One evening, 8 months after his arrival in Portland, Marcus received a call from Agent Chen. "We have your mother's reply," she said. "Can you meet tomorrow?" They met at a coffee shop in a busy part of downtown, surrounded by enough people that a private conversation could happen in public. Chen handed him an envelope. Marcus's hands shook as he opened it and unfolded the single page inside. His mother's handwriting was familiar, the loops and curves he'd seen on birthday cards and grocery lists throughout his childhood. She told him she was proud of him for choosing life over loyalty to people who never really cared about him. She told him she prayed for him every night and believed they would see each other again someday. She told him to be happy, to find love if he could, to give her grandchildren she might never meet but could hope for anyway. She told him that Marcus Webb had been a troubled son, but Michael Ortiz could be anyone he chose to be. Marcus read the letter 3 times, tears blurring the words. Chen sat across from him in silence, giving him space to feel everything that needed to be felt. When he finally looked up, his eyes were red, but his expression was determined. "Thank you," he said simply. "For everything. For saving my life. For giving me this chance, for getting this letter to me. I know it wasn't easy." "The hard part is what comes next," Chen replied. "Living with the choices you've made. Building something from nothing. Staying strong when you feel alone. Can you do that?" Marcus folded the letter carefully and put it back in the envelope. "I laid in a coffin and held my breath while armed men stood over me, deciding whether to pull the trigger. I watched my mother cry at my funeral. I left behind everyone I ever knew. Yeah, I can do hard things." Chen smiled, and it was the first time Marcus had seen her genuinely smile. "Then I think you're going to make it, Michael. I really do." They parted ways outside the coffee shop. Marcus walked back to his apartment in the fading evening light, his mother's letter pressed against his chest inside his jacket. The city around him hummed with life, cars honking, people laughing, music drifting from open windows. It was the sound of the world continuing, indifferent to his personal drama, offering him a place within its chaos, if he was willing to claim it. Back in California, Reaper sat in a maximum security prison, facing a trial that would likely result in a life sentence. His crew had been scattered across different facilities to prevent them from coordinating. The raids Chen had mentioned had been devastating. The Brotherhood's network was broken, its leadership in disarray. New leaders would eventually emerge, but the damage would take years to repair. Reaper spent his days in a cell barely larger than the coffin Marcus had hidden in, the irony not lost on him. He had stormed a funeral expecting to find a living man playing dead. Instead, he had found the death of everything he'd built. Some of the younger members were already cooperating with prosecutors, trading information for reduced sentences. The code of silence that had once been sacred was crumbling under the weight of decades-long prison terms. Late at night, when the cell block was quiet, Reaper would lie on his bunk and replay that day in the chapel. The moment when Marcus's hand had emerged from the coffin, pushing the lid open, climbing out alive, while Reaper knelt in handcuffs in the rain. He had been so certain of his intelligence, so confident in his network. And it had all been a lie carefully constructed by people smarter and more patient than he'd given them credit for. The Aryan Brotherhood had stormed a funeral, and in doing so, had attended their own. Meanwhile, in Portland, Michael Ortiz went to work each morning, came home each evening, and slowly built a life that Marcus Webb could never have imagined. He started taking classes at a community college, thinking maybe he could get certified in something that didn't require physical labor. He began dating a woman he'd met at a bookstore, someone with no connection to his past, someone who knew him only as the quiet construction worker, with kind eyes and a mysterious sadness he never quite explained. On the 1-year anniversary of his fake death, Michael stood in his apartment and raised a glass of water in silent toast. To Marcus Webb, who had died so Michael Ortiz could live, to his mother who had buried an empty casket and carried the weight of knowing her son was alive somewhere, unreachable, to Agent Chen and the marshals who had given him this impossible gift of a second chance, and to himself for having the courage to lie in a coffin and face death so he could finally choose life. The city outside his window continued its evening rhythm, oblivious to the significance of the moment. And that was exactly how Michael Ortiz wanted it. He was no one special in Portland. He was just another person trying to make it through each day, building something small and good in the spaces between morning coffee and evening television. It wasn't the life Marcus Webb had imagined, but it was a life worth living. And in the end, that was all that mattered. Years would pass. The Aryan Brotherhood would rebuild in some form, because organizations built on hate have a terrible resilience. Reaper would die in prison, a victim of violence from a rival gang, becoming a cautionary tale whispered among new recruits. Marcus's mother would eventually pass away peacefully, never having seen her son again, but knowing he was alive somewhere, living the quiet life she'd always hoped he'd find. And Michael Ortiz would continue. He'd get his certification, move into project management, meet someone he'd spend his life with. He'd have children who would never know their father had once been someone else, someone dangerous, someone who had faked his own death to escape the consequences of his choices. He'd become boring in the best possible way, his past buried so deep that even he sometimes forgot the weight of what he'd done to get here. But on quiet nights when sleep wouldn't come, he'd remember the coffin. The smell of the funeral flowers, the sound of Reaper's boots approaching, the feel of fingers pressing against his neck searching for a pulse. He'd remember the terror and the triumph, the moment when he'd climbed out of death and into life. And he'd be grateful, deeply, impossibly grateful, that he'd been brave enough to lie in that coffin and stay still while armed men decided his fate. Because the Aryan Brotherhood had stormed a funeral expecting to find a rat in a coffin. Instead, they'd found their own destruction, carefully gift-wrapped in white lilies and carnations, waiting for them like a gravestone with their names already carved into the marble. And the man they'd come to kill had walked away from his own burial, leaving behind a body that never was and becoming someone new, someone better, someone free. That was the story Marcus would never tell. That was the secret Michael would carry to his actual grave someday, decades in the future, when death finally came for real, and there would be no breathing tube, no escape hatch, no second chance. Just the end, peaceful and earned, of a life reclaimed from violence and transformed into something worth remembering. The rain continued to fall on Bakersfield, washing away the last traces of that day when everything changed. The chapel was repaired, the funeral business continued, and new griefs replaced old ones in the endless cycle of life and death. But for one man who had lain in a coffin and lived to tell no one, that day remained frozen in memory, the day he died to the world and was reborn into something better.